Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to Book Passage, to our author event for the day. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and I'm so excited to introduce Emily Willingham. She has written a candid and practical guide to the new frontier of brain customization, the tailored brain. Science is not really my area of expertise, though I have to say I do have a fascination with how the brain works. And so I'm sure not just myself, but all of you who have tuned in today are going to get some fascinating new knowledge about the brain. Dozens of books promise to improve your brain function with a gimmick: lifestyle changes, microdosing, electromagnetic stimulation. Just one weird trick can lightly alter or dramatically deconstruct your brain. In truth, there really isn't one size fits all shortcut to the ideal mind. Instead, the way to understand cognitive enhancement is to think like a tailor, measure how you need your brain to change, and then find a plan that suits it. In the Tailored Brain, Emily explores the promises and limitations of well-known and emerging methods of brain customization, including prescription drugs, diets, new research on the power of your social brain, packed with real life examples and checklists that allow readers to better understand their cognitive needs. This is the definitive guide to a better brain. Emily Willingham is a journalist and science writer. She's the author of Fallacy: Life Lessons from the Animal Penis and co-author of The Informed Parent, a science-based resource for your child's first 4 years. She is a regular contributor to Scientific American. She lives here in Marin County. She's a local author who's been to our store several times. Welcome, Emily. And in conversation with Emily is author Christie Aschwanden. Christie is author of the New York Times bestseller, Good to Go: What the Athlete and All of Us Can Learn from the Strange Science of Recovery. She's also the co-host of Emerging Form, a podcast about the creative process. Her work regularly appears in the Washington Post, New York Times, Scientific American, and other science and general interest publications. So I want to warmly welcome both of you today.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Allison.
Yep.
All right. I guess it's my turn to ask some questions. Emily, as you know, I absolutely loved your book so much. And what I really loved is that you really bring a scientific mindset to this whole question of the brain. I think we're living in a moment where there's so much bogus stuff out there regarding brain, and so many promises about ways that people can enhance their cognition that don't pan out. And yet there's some really solid science on things that really do work. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit, start off by telling us your approach to this. Is such a big topic. How did you go about it, even just starting?
That's such a great question, because it's what I had to deal with for such a long time.
Yeah.
I had to set some guardrails. I had to, first of all, maybe not look too far back in the literature. I tried to focus on things that were recent. I tried to focus on things that had really good evidence that I could look at, because if it didn't, then there's not much to look at, right? When you're writing an evidence-based book. I tried to focus on, publications that had good, solid trials and study designs, which are, by the way, when it comes to brain science and this kind of stuff, really hard to find. They're pretty elusive, and they tend to be quite inconsistent. But those were my starting points for this.
Yeah, definitely. What were some of the surprises that you found along the way?
This probably won't be a surprise to a lot of people in Marin if you're watching this, but I'm not somebody who kind of is naturally drawn, let's say, to meditation and mindfulness practices. I do have, try to do them kind of just like instinctively, but I don't deliberately practice them, or I didn't. And so one of the things I looked at in this book, because of claims around it, is the effect of mindfulness or meditation practices. And there's a pretty good evidence base for the influence of those, a positive influence of those practices on a lot of things that people want to kind of improve about their brains, about their mood or their creativity, kind of attention, stress and anxiety, things like that.
That's so interesting. And I think especially meditation and things like this can so often be sort of dismissed, I think, by scientifically minded people as being really squishy and kind of woo woo and all of that. But it sounds
Mhm.
like what you're saying is that there's some actual science and evidence behind it.
Yeah, there definitely is, and I have to say, I came to all of this pretty agnostically because you kind of
Mhm.
have to, right? If you just want to go
Yeah.
where the evidence takes you, and I wasn't closed-minded about those practices at all. They just didn't hold a lot of appeal for me because I kind of like
Yeah.
to move around a lot. But I think movement in itself can be a form of meditation, depending on how you do it. And so I was interested to find these effects, and that there were studies that were controlled studies that showed effects that were positive for people.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned movement and exercise. I wonder if you can talk about that because it feels like we're kind of homing in on some things that really are effective. And it sounds as though, well, I know this because I read the book, exercise really is something that's really helpful to the brain. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's what I like about the two things we're talking about so far is that they're pretty accessible for people.
Yeah.
You can practice mindfulness and meditation even if you just have like a minute. Like I've got an Apple Watch now that reminds me,
Yeah.
to do a breathing thing at a certain time. And for exercise, it's a subset of physical activity, right? It's the kind where we choose to do it. We do a certain thing a certain way, but more broadly, physical activity is a great thing, and there are so many reasons for that, but there's biology that underlies the effects of it.
Mhm.
Among those things is that when we do physical activity, we kind of push ourselves out of sort of a homeostasis or a balance physiologically. And so we get ourselves back into that after activity. And it may be that it's kind of like a learning process for our bodies. Our bodies
Mhm.
they learn how to do that and they get pretty good at it. And it's a nice practice so that if you sustain an insult that's dangerous from disease or something like that, your body might be like, oh, I kind of not, I'm kind of embodying a body here
Uh-huh.
and how I'm talking about this, but there's it's got the tools there to kind of deal with those insults and have some resilience that way. The
Mhm.
other thing they show about physical activity is, and I mean, this, especially if you do sort of like aerobic, really high movement physical activity, blood flow. So you get more oxygen to the brain. And there are studies that show that the metabolism in the brain and association between that and our thinking and capacities and stuff like that. And then other studies that link the production of a molecule that helps us kind of freshen up connections between neurons in the brain, the signaling cells in the brain. So there's a lot of biology underlying it.
Mhm.
And coming to it, I was like, oh, physical activity, yay, because I like it. I like to move
Right. Yeah.
around a lot, and I was like, but I was surprised at the effect size of it, which means like the size of the effect that it really does have is pretty substantial. And
Mhm.
again, we can access it. It's cooking, it's gardening, it's walking with a friend. It's what you do, which is
Yeah.
more intense than what a lot of people do. And it's what I do. I try to do 30 miles a week on my feet, and all of
Uh,
that, offers benefit.
yeah, yeah, it sure does. And there's some interesting stuff going on in the brain with neurotransmitters and stuff like this. It's not it's not just that exercise makes you feel good, which is something I really notice, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit. So we had you on my podcast called Emerging Form, which is all about creative process, talking about creativity. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. But I wanted to start since we were just talking about exercise. It seems as though there's a link between exercise and creativity. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'd be glad to talk about that link because it's interesting to me. One of the things that I came across, and it's not like a ton of evidence behind it or anything, is that anxiety might kind of have a role as a disorder of movement or motion. And if you can, the fidget spinners that they came out with,
Yeah.
who are really kind of high revving kids and things like that, that it can alleviate it. And we know that, I think we can have that experience of you feel loaded by the day. And if you can get out and do something that's movement, it helps release that load. Well, anxiety is in direct opposition a lot of the time to creativity,
Mhm.
because if you're dealing with that, you don't have a lot of space left to devote to the kinds of thinking that are associated with being creative. And
Yeah.
so I think that that's where that link comes in. It's one way, one direction to come into it through physical activity.
Hmm. And can you talk a little bit about just creativity in the brain in general? What's going on? What are the things that make a brain creative? And what are sort of the necessary conditions? If I'm someone who's trying to improve my creative thinking, what are some things that I can do?
Wow.
And
So
I am that person, by the way.
same, I know,
Yeah.
right? So I give a personal experience. If I am overloaded with work that I just have to do, but and I always have a very creative urge. I always want to be creating and then think
Uh-huh.
creatively. But it's difficult to do if you're overburdened with like sort of the everyday things that you have to deal with. And if you are sitting there and everybody has, most people have this experience where you're really trying to think of something interesting or creative, and then just things come at you from all directions.
Yeah.
Somebody starts bleeding and then something catches on fire, and you're just like, how do you do that if you don't have the space mentally and in terms of time and physically around you,
Yeah.
right, to get yourself centered and open up your mind that way. So part of it is reducing the burdens that are coming at you from all around you, which
Uh-huh.
is where a practice like mindfulness might come in and
Mhm.
help reduce that burden. That's where physical activity might come in and help reduce that burden. So you have the space for that, just kind of letting your freak flag fly inside your head.
Uh-huh. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the benefits too of daydreaming or giving yourself time to, maybe not be so scheduled and overtaxed with your brain?
Yeah, I wish I could reap some of those right now. I'm feeling it a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can get yourself away from things, even if it's just for 20 minutes,
Mhm.
and just not think about or attend to those and go on a walk or stare at a tree or this beautiful plant behind me or whatever works for you, and just let your mind wander. There's potentially a circuit in your mind that will start to do things like review like what you've done before, where you might go later, and it kind of can feed imagination. And you can also can be negative. It can take you in a spiral that you don't want to get
Rumination, yeah.
into, which is where kind of like you've got to alert yourself and go, oh no, I'm spiraling, and get yourself out of that. But if you can just let it wander to good places and let that happen, sometimes you run into things and you make connections. Everybody's probably had this, right? The epiphanies, like you're just on a walk and all of a sudden you go, oh, that's how I make that work. You're a writer. I'm a writer. You've probably had this experience, right? Where
Oh,
you're
yeah.
trying to like work out the flow of something and you can't
Mhm.
make it go. And even if you're like asleep or you're just waking up when your mind is just not very busy yet and it kind of comes to you. So you do have to make that mental space for it to work.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Now, I wonder, you looked into a lot of different cognitive enhancers for this book. Are there other things that you found for creativity? I mean, I know there are so many things. I live in Colorado, and I found recently at one of our cannabis shops, they were selling a product that was THC that was supposed to be for creativity. And I was like, ooh, should I try that? And to be clear, I haven't, but should I try that?
I don't know. I'm really scared. I have a quote in that book that I won't quote here because I don't know if the language situation, but don't F with your brain, kid, right?
Yeah,
As
right.
I mean, that's me, but other people do what they like to do and it works for them. It's interesting you bring that up because it has this effect of kind of lowering certain inhibitions I think that we have internally. And what they think might be going on is that again, there are these sort of circuits in the brain, and if one of them is kind of hushed up, which is the one that makes you focus on yourself and all that kind of stuff, you can kind
Mhm.
of shut that thing up and then let other things kind of come into you and come to you. Well, maybe drugs like that and psychedelics sort of operate on that and set the stage for that one thing to shut up so that you can access all these other inputs from the world and use those to be creative.
Mhm.
Are you gonna
Mhm.
do it?
I don't know. I haven't, but I have to admit I'm tempted. And I think this is such an interesting thing though, because it's so true. So, when I was working on my book, which is about exercise recovery, and I looked into a lot of products that were supposed to be doing things, and there were so many instances where I'm like, this doesn't work. but does it? And there's that sort of little temptation where you're like, oh, but if it does, I really like, I don't want to pass up a chance. And there's so much marketing around some of this stuff. And I think they really get us with that sort of sense of expectancy, right?
Yeah, they do. And the thing is that, I mean, I can't say 100% don't try the thing, right?
Yeah.
Because when you look at the evidence, they're looking at evidence usually that's an average, right? In a
Right.
group or something like that. And so, regardless of how it really happens, regardless if there's physiology underlying it or, the brain's activity interacting with the rest of the body's physiology, some people experience effects.
Right.
And, I don't want to be the person that says that's not real, because
Yeah.
for them it's real. And so I can't say like, well, Christy, if you go try the THC,
Right. Yeah.
make you more creative. I
Yeah.
personally won't do it because, I can barely take like a Tylenol without
Uh-huh.
feeling more creative from it. So I probably don't need the THC.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm a Generation Xer, and I remember, when I was in high school, they had these ads that were like, "This is your brain on drugs, the fried
Yeah.
egg." Remember that?
Yeah.
And
Oh,
we were
yeah.
told that it was going to fry your brain. I mean, did you find any evidence of that? That these psychoactive drugs were really ruining our brains?
So again, this is so individual, right? For some
Yeah.
people, they can be exposed to something like THC. Timing is a big deal, and of course, doses.
Yeah.
And the brain is going through a reconstruction process through adolescence, of course. And
Mhm.
when you're reconstructing something, if you inject some new element into that, the structure
Yeah.
you intended to get may not be, or that it was expected may not turn out the way
Uh-huh.
you anticipated, right?
Sure.
But I know a young person who's not going to do things like this during that process, but his plan is when he's in his 70s and 80s, he's going to start trying psychedelics
Uh-huh.
because then he'll be well past that stage and it probably will be
Yeah.
okay.
Sure. Sure. One of the things that's mentioned actually in the subtitle of your book is keto. And I wonder, I write about nutrition and stuff and fitness. And so I get a lot of questions about the keto diet. And there's this idea that it's really good for your brain. What did you find out when you looked into that?
It's interesting because that term has kind of lost, it's been diluted so much that,
Mm.
it's kind of like saying cancer, almost, not in terms of the cause, the harm it can cause, but just in the meanings that it carries, because cancer is a million different things, right?
Mm.
And the keto diet, as people talk about it, is also a lot of different things. And so it's hard to pin down, what people are really referencing. What there is an evidence base for is a keto diet that is controlled by a nutritionist. It's prescribed for people who have intractable seizures. And it's been known since, at least in the Western world, since the times of the ancient Greeks, that if they removed carbohydrates from a diet and sort of increased the other forms of nutrition like fats, especially, I think that might help control these
Mhm.
seizures, or they called them something else. And so
Yeah.
that is one thing that is applicable, but as far as the rest of what people call keto diets, it's really kind of unclear.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it's a little bit mixed. Um, was there anything that you encountered? There's probably multiple things that was really like, no, wait, this is just ridiculous. Don't bother. Don't waste your time. Was that something you found a lot?
I found, by honestly, I wasn't super surprised by it because you've seen
Uh-huh.
hints of it, but things like learning chess, not super helpful, which,
Uh-huh.
not that I was planning to, but it's kind of
Yeah.
disappointing. Things that we think of as like kind of, I think what we tend to do is equate the brain to being a muscle, because people sometimes
Yeah.
metaphorize the brain that way. It's not a muscle, and so you're not going to like build it up just because you worked it out.
Uh-huh.
And I think that helps conflate some of these things. And so when you do brain games and you put your brain through activities and stuff like that, there's not a lot that shows that those are doing anything. And most of the places where there's quote unquote evidence provided for that from the companies, telling
Yeah,
you
of course. The
yeah,
companies all have their own evidence, right? Their own
yeah,
study.
they're yeah. And so there was not a ton there. If you like them, do crossword puzzles. If you enjoy that, do it, but don't, not with any anticipation of, wow, I'm gonna like not get old now.
Right. But isn't that what we're all looking for? I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's an existential thread to this where we're all sort of looking to evade death on some level. And we're all looking to, avoid those age-related cognitive declines. And so we're vulnerable to these claims.
I think that that's true. It's funny because very young people seem to be pretty attracted to quote unquote brain hacking, and hacking is
Yeah.
like a big thing. And everybody talks about that a lot, but they're so young, yeah, to be kind of that's their focus, or that they want to be quote unquote smarter, which
Mhm.
is, elusive at best. And we are going to get older,
Yeah.
right? And our
Unless you
brain,
don't, and that's no good either,
oh,
right?
I know that would be kind of weird, right? And our brains are going to get older with us. And there are some things that you can do to mitigate to some extent, but nothing is a guarantee. One of the things that's really helpful is physical activity, coming back to that, because as we get older, we become less able to rebound from insults, like, to our bodies through disease and injuries and stuff like that. But physical activity, like I said, one of the things it may do is contribute to our kind of reflexive ability to recover and to have that resilience as we get
Mhm.
older.
Can you talk a little bit about neuroplasticity and what we know about that now, and particularly in regards to age?
Mhm. That's one of the things, right? So there's a molecule, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor is what it's called. I
Yep.
always hate to like say the big word, words that nobody's ever going to remember unless you're just completely into this.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that it's alleged to do is to contribute to what we call neuroplasticity, which is this ability to freshen up, form new connections in the brain so that, like if you sustain, and we have kind of an excess. And so kind of the hope is if you get an injury, like if you have a stroke or an injury like that, and there's some remarkable stories of this, right? Where people, they get workarounds because they've got these other connections to contribute to the
Mhm.
recovery. And so plasticity is a big deal and it's important. And again, physical activity is connected with increased levels of that molecule that promotes it. And so definitely, not definitely, I hate to say that as a scientist or any
Yeah.
other, scientific endeavor, but it likely is, promotional for that.
Yeah, for sure. Here's a question someone submitted. Could you talk a little bit about your chapter on mood cognition? So many people are suffering from depressive disorders as a result of the pandemic, global concerns, and the political climate. What do you have to tell us and share for that?
So I want to preface this by saying I'm not a clinician, and
Uh-huh.
if you do feel, that your mood is interfering with your activities of daily living and really just getting in the way of things, do consult a professional about that.
Mhm.
What I found though, if you haven't reached that kind of threshold, but it's kind of getting to you, or you just don't want to feel it all day every day, the
Mhm.
things that I found that are useful. I'm going to say it again, Christy. I'm going to say the phrase again. Physical activity
Yeah,
is helpful,
yeah.
because there's a connection between mood and anxiety. And so if
Mhm.
you do things that kind of alleviate the stress or the anxiety, that can help the mood. And the other thing is the mindfulness. I,
Uh-huh.
like probably many, many people during the last, I would say at this point, 6 years at least, have just been sitting there and suddenly, internal circuit in the brain that maybe rules this is like, oh my God, everything is on fire. How can you even do anything right now? When that happens to me, I do now try these kind of mindfulness practices where I become aware of that with a different network. It's called the Salience Network. I say, oh, you're doing the thing where you're freaking yourself out. But right now, you actually need to finish the work you're doing so you can get paid because you still have to eat, even if the world is on fire.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Gotta
And so
meet
I
your
click
deadline.
back into the moment and I
Yeah.
look around and I try to see things just right now around me. I'm lucky enough to say that when I do that, things are okay.
Mhm.
And, I'm sitting in a comfortable seat and, the air is nice. And I just
Yeah.
try to remind myself of all that right now. And I know this is kind of bleak. I know you have another question, but this is the bleakest thing. But I also think, if I just drop dead tomorrow, would I want to do that looking back, thinking I spent the last 24 hours just angry and pissed and depressed? Or would I want to think, at least I appreciated a few things before
Yeah.
I went?
Yeah, that's a good mindset. I was just going to ask if there are any things that you changed after researching this book. Are there new habits you adopted or new things that you're doing now that you weren't doing before you were researching this book? Like, how is it? What have you done in your own life?
That's a great question. And the two things that I did, so I was already a walker, like I walk and hike a lot. It's just something I do. But I ticked that up and made sure it's something I do every day. As you have written yourself, the walk is not negotiable.
The
And that's
walk
a
is not
walk with
negotiable.
is not negotiable. And that's a walk with another person, which is a
Yeah.
different, it's a whole separate like input and utility. But I make sure I do it every single day, that
Mm.
I can get on my feet and do that. And I have set a goal for, number of miles a week. And that I just sort of insist on hitting. And I do feel better from doing that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the mindfulness thing. I would not have known before I started researching this book or really realized the utility of what I just described of just stop spiraling, get yourself back in the moment and click
Yeah.
in on, what's around you right now that's good.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm kind of a monkey brain, and while I was researching my book, I have a chapter about mindfulness and psychology of recovery. And
Yeah.
I actually went to one of these float tanks, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I fell in love with it. I really was worried I wasn't going to be able to last the whole hour, and I ended up, wanting wanting to stay. It was so nice, but it was forced meditation for the monkey brain. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, on the sort of like, if you're someone who has to force yourself to meditate, like, is it still working?
I know, isn't that funny? I think
Yeah.
so. What I learned, and people who do this all the time know this. This is not new to anybody who practices these things, but you get better with practice. You can
Yeah.
actually do it more readily and more easily and more effectively the more that you practice it. And I have a kind of funny thing related to your tank, except my tanks have been MRI machines, and I know
Oh,
it's
interesting.
weird
Yeah.
because they're really noisy, right? But what
Uh-huh.
they do is, or what I have them do, I get little headphones and then I have them put a little towel on my face. And so it's kind of a sensory deprivation with just a
Uh-huh.
lot of thumping, but I can't do anything else in there. I can't multitask. I can't work. I can't help somebody if they're bleeding, or something catches on fire. I can't do any of those things. And so I'm just forced to lie there and get inside my own head while there's this kind of rhythm, boom, 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 boom thing going on. And it
Mhm.
actually helps my monkey brain when I do that.
Yeah, I love that. I just read this fantastic book recently. What was it called? It was the encyclopedia or the dictionary of,
Yes,
what was it
I have
called?
that. I have it. I won't get up and go get it, but yes.
Anyway, I don't have it. It was actually a library book, which I've since returned, but I blogged about it at Last Word on Nothing. So if anyone's interested, and this was just like a week ago that I wrote the blog. See, my memory's already gone. But there was
Obscure
a book.
Sorrows.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
Dictionary of Obscure
Of
Sorrows.
Obscure Sorrows,
Yeah.
wonderful book. But one of the entries describes this feeling of being sort of stuck in a place where you can't be productive, where there's nothing, no one can call you. And the examples they used were like stuck on an airplane, which of course now there's Wi-Fi on airplanes, which I think is terrible because now there's an
No.
expectation. Like I actually had an editor say, "Oh yeah, I sent you the edit, but you can look on the plane." And I was like, "No, I'm not going to do that."
How? Like elbow the people next to you over?
But there is this sort of delightful feeling of being somewhere where there's just, it's like you don't have a choice. I can't, it's like being out in the wilderness or whatever. And at the end of this month, I'm going with some friends to this cabin. This is a yearly trip that we do. We're totally offline, and it's just fantastic. It's like whatever's happening in the world can't reach us, unless it's a fire that's going to burn down the forest. But yeah, there's something really
Possibility.
wonderful, and there's
Yeah.
something that happens in your brain when that's going on, right?
Yeah, so there are places where I live. I'm lucky enough to live where there's a lot of green space, and there are places you can go, and I know which ones they are where you cannot get cell access.
Yeah.
And I deliberately will go to those places to just get away because I know that yeah, you compulsively or like you check the thing and you look at the email. I can't do that in those places, and it is it's hard to describe how important it is to do that for your brain, I think. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. So I'm wondering if you have been able to sort of distill, are there like the 3 habits of the smart brain or something, like, are there things that you would recommend people do that they might not be, if you can only do a few things, what would
Right.
be your recommendations?
I did have a distillation, and it's funny because the book title says feeling better and thinking smarter, but it doesn't say thinking smarter about what.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so one of the things that, I really hammer on in the book is that we're very focused on making ourselves individually better or smarter in some way,
Yeah.
even though we're an intensely social species and
Mhm.
our interactions with each other are almost like an ecosystem itself.
Yeah.
And so what we do for ourselves, we do for others. So in the book, I emphasize a great deal this kind of social cognition and what interaction with others and non-toxic interactions, of course, can
Uh-huh.
do
Yeah.
for us, right? And so, in addition to the mindfulness, there's physical activity, but you can intensify the effects of physical activity if you do it sometimes with a partner or a person with whom you're intimate, whom you can trust, and you share a burden of anxiety instead of keeping it all to yourself, or the burden of stress, or you talk about your day. And we do that through the way we do that, I think is unique to our species because there are species that can tell each other stories,
Uh-huh.
but we can tell stories across lengths of time that no other species that I know of can or does across thousands and thousands of years, right? And
Uh-huh.
connect our brains with people like that. And so making those social connections across time and space and in real time is actually something that helps us a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And this is that whole social brain concept that you're talking about, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So a big aspect of that is empathy.
Hmm.
And there are people who think that empathy is something that's kind of inborn, and there's some aspect like there's a really interesting a person who's characterized this in a really interesting way. Now I can't remember her name because aging brain, and but she's characterized it, and as somebody who used to be a developmental biologist, this is compelling to me that we're kind of born with the materials that we might need to construct the sort of empathy circuits that we would rely on as humans. But it's not that we just kind of come out and we're just like immediately empathic in every possible way, because there are different kinds of empathy, and
Hmm.
you can learn empathy, and you can kind of you can practice it, and practice makes you better at it. And I think that's something that we have a serious deficit of right now. But when you look at all these things about how do you improve your brain, how do you make your brain better, and all this other stuff, despite the fact that we are a social species, and despite the fact that we do rely on empathy in a lot of what we do to be social successfully, almost none of it is about making that better or practicing
Uh-huh.
that more.
Yeah.
And so I did focus on that quite a bit in the book.
Yeah, those were really interesting sections. I enjoyed that a lot and found it really, really interesting. I want to go back to this idea of hacking and brain hacking because it's so prevalent right now. And there's sort of
Uh,
this idea that we could optimize everything and particularly optimize our thinking. And I just wonder if you have any insights on that and whether there's something to that, or is this mindset not helpful?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with saying that the things that they're trying to hack that aren't brains, that doesn't even work. They're like,
Uh,
oh, we'll optimize this and this thing will work seamlessly. And none of it does. None of it is seamless. None of it is optimized. And we're just talking about, hardware and
mm,
software. And our brains are neither. People do metaphorize our brains as being wired, but 50% of the cells in our brain do not communicate electrically, and they have a huge role to play in what's going on in there. We are not just a wired computer. We don't metaphorize penguins or trees that way because they're organic, and there's a lot more going on besides that. So you can't just take the brain and get some really like amazing biohacking tools and go in
yeah,
there and like tweak the wiring and do reconnect it or rewire it, which is my favorite
yeah,
thing, and get some outcome that folks are promising you. It's not, as I say in the book, it is not a slot machine. You can't just
yeah.
drop something in and pull a little lever and then this thing comes out, one of three options pops up. That's not how the brain works.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so interesting, and it feels as though those sort of improper metaphors are really standing in the way of of using our brains better, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. And we've had so many improper metaphors. The
Uh,
sperm brain is one of my favorite ones.
sperm brain, yeah, tell us about that.
Well, I mean, it's an ancient one. It's a few, at least I think from the Middle Ages, but they thought that the sperm traveled up the spinal cord to the Right. I'm not sure that operated if you didn't make sperm. Like, I don't know. Although I do think they might have conflated all sort of products of the gonads as sperm back then. So maybe that's why,
Interesting.
or, and then there was another, it was like there was a little blowhole to release vapors that you built up in your body and things like that. So
Uh,
there have been some weird metaphorizations of the brain. But the wired one, I think you're right, is kind of damaging, which is why I start at the beginning of the book is saying, no, it's more like a planet, and it has regions and continents and things that are connected by communication networks, and
mhm.
but there's a lot more going on beyond that. And so I try to think of it in terms of something that you can map physically and spatially. Mhm.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. So it sounds like exercise is perhaps the most important thing or the best way you can approach this to making your brain work better and thinking better. What would you say to people that are picking up your book looking for the secret hacks and the best things or the things they can buy? Are they going to be disappointed? And what would you tell the ones who are looking for some quick fix?
Well, first I would ask you, because I know that you've been through that, right?
I
So
have been
yeah,
through
your
that.
your book is very one reason we're having this conversation, right, is because we've talked about that, like your book is just so evidence-based, and it doesn't come down and make big promises that aren't supported. And so it's kind of, people who are looking for that, they will be in a sense that disappointment. And I think,
Mhm.
with a book like that, that's you can't help that if you're not
Yeah.
going to be somebody who's just being a charlatan. So if they pick it up and they're like, "Oh, I'm looking for the hack," the hack is in there,
Yeah.
and it's us. We are the hack, and it's
Yeah.
moving our bodies around. It's being physically active. It is making sure that we remind ourselves to be mindful, and it is interacting in positive ways with each other, sharing stories and stresses and the problems of the world with each other, and not just keeping it all to ourselves.
Yeah, that last point is really interesting and important. And I know there's a pretty big body of research showing that in terms of healthy aging and people who do better as they age and are cognitively healthy are ones that the social interaction seems to be really important. So this isn't just a matter of like feeling better, but it actually is directly correlated to brain health and cognition, right?
Right, yeah, this isn't I'm not just being kumbaya, which is not
Yeah.
really my
Yeah.
instinct, as you might know. But yeah, the again, the size of those effects is pretty good of, being able to stay connected, which is why it's so important. Our society tends to be like, "Oh, you're getting old, bye," right? And then
Mhm.
put you somewhere, and, that is if you're really gonna pay attention to what the evidence says, it's the exact opposite of what we should be doing, of course. We should be
Mhm.
respecting aging. We should not be sort of, I don't know, not appreciating the meaning of it just because we might think a little more slowly as we get older, or take a little time to look for a word, or tell a story again that we've
Uh-huh.
already told. That's not a reason to be dismissive. It's just a reason to be patient and to share with that person in the way that
Mhm.
they can share.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting going back to the idea of, disappointment over there not being the quick fix. I think we all want the quick fix, but in a way, I feel like if I know that Emily Willingham, who is, very smart and you spent all this time researching this stuff, if you've looked and you've determined that there is not that quick fix, the pill or the quick hack or the app I can put on my phone or whatever that quick fix is, in a way I can sort of stop looking for it, right, and not worry. So there's kind of that FOMO or that feeling of, well, I think this doesn't work, but maybe it does, and I don't want to miss out. If I can dismiss that, then I can actually just put my efforts towards the things that actually do work.
I like what you said, because I think, in your book, I think we kind of land in similar places, which is you don't need to stress yourself out about what you just said. Am I not doing exactly the right thing? Did I not precisely weigh this out in exactly the right amount for recovery? Or do I need to try the THC to be more creative?
Yeah.
Or can I just go on a longer ski? And I think it does help. I'm hoping, right, that your takeaway can be generalized to others, that you don't really need to worry about it. And the tools for this are to hand. And if you know they're there, and access them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of it comes down to, I mean, a lot of what I'm hearing you say is about managing anxiety and managing stress. We all have both of those things in our lives. And so, letting go of that can be really helpful and actually can help your brain work better because it's not being occupied with this stuff that doesn't help us.
Yeah, and that yes, exactly, like, we don't need to add on, right? More
Right.
worry
Don't
about
pile
things.
on.
Yeah, exactly. So for recovery, like you talk about, or if you're a parent, everybody's telling you how things ought to be done, or you need to do it exactly this way
Totally.
or that way, and you know what? None of that is actually the case, and it
Mhm.
does just add on more stress for people to be imposing this on you and to say to you, "Oh, well, if you haven't tried such and such, then, well, you suck," or whatever
Yeah.
that and so it is good, I think, to have people like you, or maybe even somebody like me, to look at the evidence and sift it in a trustworthy way and say, no, you don't have to worry about that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the nice thing is there really are things that work, and the things that work generally aren't the things that cost money or,
Yes.
are things that you can download or purchase, right?
I
They're
know.
free and available to everyone.
That is one of the beautiful things about it, is that you do not have to do specialty things to access this stuff, right? And you, like, for your recovery thing, you don't have to buy specialty equipment, or you have a specialty membership somewhere or anything like that. And for your brain, for your mood, your anxiety, your stress, your social cognition, and that kind of stuff, you just need to do the physical activity the level that you can,
Yeah.
an area that interests you. You don't even have to stress about that, right? You don't
Yeah.
have to do 30 miles or 100 miles a week. You don't have to do anything like that. You don't have to eat special food. And you just need to know, you don't have to know 30 people. When I say social, that's not
Yeah.
me. You just kind of need to, have one or two intimates with whom you can share these things.
Oh, here it is. We have a question from Paul Jackson who says, I understand THC. What about CBD?
Yeah, this this is, now why are you laughing? Because I know why I
I'm
asked.
laughing because I get this question at almost every book
Yeah.
talk that I get.
Yeah, yeah. So the research is so mixed. The evidence is
Oh,
mixed, right? So most people are trying this. Well, I didn't address pain because that wasn't
mm,
one of the sort of
right.
cognitive aspects, but I did address anxiety and stress. And the evidence is mixed in the studies. And again, that doesn't mean that it doesn't do something for some people. It doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily mean that at all. These are average effects. If you look at antidepressants,
Yeah.
they don't best placebo necessarily in a
Right.
lot of studies, but there's this kind of binary bimodal distribution. So there are some people it doesn't seem to do anything for, and then on this other end, there are people who did experience an effect. And so, there are a lot of mysteries yet to unravel. And I'm not going to come down and just go, hell no, CBD does not do
Yeah.
what people claim. No.
Yeah. This does get me though to wonder about something we haven't really discussed, and that is sleep and the cognitive effects of not getting enough sleep. And
Yeah.
the reason I had been looking for the THC in the first place, I actually tried some edibles at one point when I was having trouble sleeping, and it worked wonders.
Oh, cool.
Um, that's I know a lot of people use it for that. I tried it a couple times, but I'm just curious about sleep in general, and if that's something that helps with.
Yeah, it does, right? Of course it
Yeah.
does. It'd be great to get good sleep, and it is one of the best things you can do for yourself. And by good, I think so I don't write a lot about sleep in the book, but I do know, I've done I've written about sleep in other places. And it's about regularity and routine, right? Going same time at night, getting up in the morning, and the number of hours you need is, pretty idiosyncratic. Some people need more than
Yeah.
others. And but as far as getting the good sleep, it's weirdly enough, the stuff, some of the things that help with that are physical activity. I should have just
Yeah.
entitled though. I didn't know at the time when I started writing the
Physical
book
activity, that's the
it was going to be that one, but that's definitely one of them. And offloading stress with, people whom you trust, or a couple of things. As far as the, taking things and supplements and things like that, that has to be very idiosyncratic. Yeah.
Mhm. So there's another question here from Henrietta Snodgrass who asks, psilocybal therapy seems to be one of the new hope. Is that covered in your book?
It is, and I have the most interesting study in here, and I'm sorry, I have to find this quote because it's just such an interesting thing. I hope I have this quote here. They did a study that's called an N of one study. And in this, what that means is that they had 100, I think it was 99 or 100 people, yeah, here it is, participating in this study, and they were already people who microdosed with psilocybin, I think psilocybin mostly. And the way they worked the study is that they spent 4 weeks taking their pills every day, but the researchers are kind of jacked around with the pills, and so some of them were empty and some of them weren't. So they were their own placebo, and then they kept a journal, like, this is how this is making you feel.
Uh-huh.
And in the end, they reported, oh, it's making me feel something, and some of them were placebo the entire time.
Oh,
and
interesting.
and so yeah, they were experiencing this placebo effect. And so the quote from one of them is, you put spirituality in an empty pill here, wow. And so I kind of think, like, it's a fine line, right? Like, how much do you destroy somebody's benefit by just
Yeah.
saying, well, this doesn't work because it worked for them, and like the process by which that worked, how much does that matter in the end? But what does matter is, do you proselytize it to somebody else and make this promise that it's going to work for them, and it doesn't, and then it's been an expense, or a trial or a risk, and that kind of thing. So that's pretty touchy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a fine line, isn't it? I have a chapter on placebos in my book, and I kind of come to a similar point where I sort of argue that we can harness the placebo effect for
Yeah.
good. At the same time, I don't want to support, charlatans who are selling placebos deliberately. But there is this very well documented expectation effect. And I wonder with something like psilocybin, whether there's a ritual that goes along with that too. Did you find anything about rituals?
I didn't find it, I didn't look at rituals per se, but I do know that I do know. I hypothesize based on
Uh-huh.
the things I saw, that if we appreciate routine, that our
Mhm.
bodies kind of appreciate routine. And if we set an expectation for routine, that's another way that our bodies get the signal if something's gone out of range, that it can get back into range, because like the time is off, and that kind of thing. And so in that sense, routine is very helpful, in that ritual around like microdosing. And another thing about rituals is, it reduces anxiety. I am not actually a superstitious person, but I do have anxiety if somebody makes a prediction about something. They're like, it'll be fine. I'm like, oh my God, you said the thing out loud, and I knocked wood. And I don't do it because I literally think knocking wood is going to help. I just,
Right.
because that lets me just forget that I got worried about it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a
For
ritual.
sure.
It helps.
Yeah. We have a couple other really great questions here. Well, let's Paul Jackson asks, can you rebuild myelin?
I don't know. I don't know, but from what I knew the last time, I would have considered something like that. No, because then we probably would have a cure for something like multiple sclerosis, which is
Right.
scarring
Right.
that
Yeah.
tissue. Yeah.
I really like this question from Ariel J. Smythe. It sounds simple. Meditate slash pray, move one's body, rest, and stay connected with empathetic others. Why do you think it is that we keep seeking something beyond these tried and truths?
I think it's because people have something to sell. I think that they tell
Uh,
you you have a problem. They say you're not smart enough, you don't think fast enough, or you're too attention deficit. Not that I think
mhm.
these things can be a problem, obviously. It can be a problem to not have the attention that you want to things, right?
Mhm.
But just on the broader, kind of more general audience scale, people are like, oh, you have an issue and I have the thing that's going to solve it. And here
Yeah.
are 25 studies supporting that, even though it's really just like one study of the same group of people cut up into 100 pieces
Right.
that tried to make it
Mhm.
look more bulky. So that's part of it. And I think part of it is our values as a culture and a society. We don't value aging, and we don't value empathy very highly. We think that the best people are the smart people, or the rich people, or the rich people who seem smart. And so when somebody tries to sell us something and tells us that's going to make us that way, we want to believe it because we have kind of been cultured to think that way.
Mhm. Mhm. And that's part of the sell, isn't it too, that there's a better you out there for purchase?
Right. Yeah, it is part of the sell. And the thing is that there maybe is a better you, but it comes from in you and not something so far that I found that you can take. And it's not just coming from inside you, and then boom, you've become whatever it is you think you want to be, which is one of the things I ask people to interrogate in this book. Why are
Mhm.
you trying to fix something? Why do you think the thing needs fixing? Did somebody tell you that? Does society tell you that? Are you absolutely uncomfortable with it yourself? And kind of parse those things out before you start trying to do anything, because it may be that you're just being told it's a
Yeah.
problem, but it's not really one for you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. I think that's something a lot of us have experienced and
Yes,
seen. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I'm wondering, I'm looking here in the chat to see. This might be a good time to just thank everyone for coming. Looks like we
Oh,
might
I think
have.
we might be getting
Yeah.
another one. Well, can I ask you a question though about recovery? Like
Sure.
if you had to distill it down into your recommendations, what are like your top two or three things that you would say?
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's so much overlap with yours. So sort of the three things that I talk about are sleep. So making sure to get enough sleep just as a general habit and all of that. Number two, managing stress. And I always say manage rather than eliminate or reduce because we all have stress. And I think the key is not to think of it even as bad, but just to
Yeah.
figure out a way to sort of address it and manage it so it's not, managing you. But then the third, and I feel like this is something you've talked about a little bit too, is that I really recommend that people have a daily relaxation ritual.
Yeah.
And this is something that they're doing. I mean, for me and you, Emily, it's the walk is not negotiable, right? And so, but it's really this part of your day where there's no expectation of being productive. Your mind is just allowed to wander. You're sort of giving your body bandwidth to just sort of breathe in and sort of create creatively. You're refilling the well. You're letting your mind wander a little bit. You're letting your body relax. So you're not taxing it too much, although light exercise might be part of it. For me, this morning walk is part of that. And I find that that's really an important thing. And it's amazing how many people don't do that and don't prioritize it.
And it's hard for them to prioritize it, right? Because we've
Yeah.
also created a culture where everything is just overloaded all the time. You're really right. So true about stress, because there's stress that's positive, like the kind that
Yeah.
makes you meet a deadline. That's really, that's
Right.
a
Yeah.
decent
That's the only way I
level
can.
of stress. But yeah, you don't want it to control you. That's such a
Yeah.
good point. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up. I want to thank you guys so much for this fabulous conversation. We had great questions, and I love the interaction between the two of you. It was great. And I want to show everybody the book and let you know that we do have copies here available at Book Passage. You can call and order a copy. You can come into our store in either San Francisco or Corte Madera. And you can also order online. So I highly recommend it.
Buy the book.
Yeah, it's fabulous. It has some fantastic advice. And for those of you in the Bay Area, she is a local author. So support local authors, support independent bookstores. And I want to thank both of you again and thank our audience so much. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.